Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here, and whether you're new or returning, I hope you enjoy the video. This week I'll be making a bowl from 3 segmented rings and white coloured epoxy resin. Without further ado, let's get into it. The segments I'm cutting are Sapele. Each ring has 18 segments cut with a 10-degree angle on each end, and this time I'm using the table saw with a miter jig, which is much faster than the miter saw I used last time. With the segments cut for the first 2 rings, it was time to assemble them. Each piece was sanded, cleaned up the edges, then I put them together to form the ring, with a hose clamp loosely holding them. To create the gaps between the segments, I'd cut some mixing sticks into short lengths. I inserted one of these pieces in between each of them, making sure the thin strips were close to the outer edge. With that done, I tightened the hose clamp to bring it all together. A few of the pieces had to be nudged into position, but with the hose clamp tight, the joints looked good for the next bit. To hold the ring together for casting, more sticks were cut in half, then I superglued them in place, being careful not to get any glue into the joints. I only used the accelerator to get the job done faster. For the first ring, I removed the hose clamp, then I did the other side, but for the next 2 rings, I left it in place until both sides were done. I won't show the second one being done, it's the same as the first. So we're both done, I then had to glue them together. I wanted to space the rings apart to form a bigger joint, so I glued 2 additional spacers on top, then I superglued the upper ring in place. But I had to make a decision, whether or not to stagger the vertical joints or have them in line. The bricklayer in me decided they had to be half bonded, so that's what I did. Gluing the 2 rings together was the last thing to do before the first casting. I considered making a circular Sapele infill piece for the middle void, but I was running out of time, though to save resin, this is something I will be doing on any similar projects in the future. After placing the rings into a waxed casting bucket, I mixed the epoxy resin. I figured I would need to mix 2 batches to more or less fill it level with the top ring. As ever, it's my favourite brand of resin, mixed at a 2:1 ratio. With both parts in the mixing cup, I added a liberal amount of mica powder, white being the colour of choice for this project. Resin mixed, I poured it into the casting bucket, and to my surprise there was nowhere near enough, so I mixed another batch. Not quite a full one, but hopefully enough. With the final batch in the bucket, the resin just covered the rings, so I added some weight on top, and off camera I put it in the pressure pot, added 50 to 55 psi, and left it overnight to cure. It's the next day and time to make the third and last ring. It's more or less the same as before, except the segments are bigger, 40mm on the long side, rather than the others which were cut at 31mm on the long side. And just to recap, after cutting each one, each was sanded, then the ring was loosely assembled, the spacers inserted into the gaps, then mixing sticks were superglued in place on both sides, then the hose clamp was removed, along with the spacers, and it was done. blank had been curing overnight, and with it removed from the pressure pot, I could see the resin level had dropped quite a lot, but there was nothing I could do about it. So the next job was to sand the top ring on the drum sander. This was done to remove the excess resin and the mixing sticks, to leave a clean surface for the next casting. After re-waxing the casting bucket, the blank was dropped back in. Then I superglued a waste block in place with spaces between it and the top ring. And if you're wondering, I did 2 castings to reduce the chance of the resin overheating and cracking. It's a problem I had a couple of projects back, which I didn't want to repeat. Waste block in place. Next I mixed 3 batches of resin, again coloured with white mica powder. These were poured into the casting bucket straight away. Then I added some weight to hold the blank in place. This was then put in the pressure pot liner. That done, I had another piece to cast at the same time, the segmented rim. Off camera, I wrapped packing tape around the segmented ring. I was hoping this would contain the resin and cut down on the amount needed. But just to be sure, I put it in a silicone baking mould, just in case it leaked. I used a smaller baking mould with weights in it to fill the centre void, then this was added to the liner, on top of the main blank. I put the whole thing into the pressure pot, then next I mixed a single batch of resin and added it to the segmented rim. And there were no leaks, so I added some weight to hold it in place, and with the lid tightly screwed down, I added 50 to 55 psi and left it to cure overnight. Or at least that was the plan. What actually happened was, I only left it a couple of hours, then I opened the pot to check the rim casting, and it had leaked. So I added more resin, then it went back into the pressure pot, and then I did leave it overnight to cure. It's the next day, and with the rim and the main blank removed, I could see that both had cured without any cracks or voids. Witness line between the 2 casting pours, but this was in the mid-segmented ring, so I didn't think it would be a problem. I chiselled away the unused bit of waste block, marked the centre, and drilled a hole for the woodworm screw. Then the blank was fixed to the lathe, using the tailstock for added support. With the lathe turned up to around 850 RPM, I could begin turning away my material. Using the Woodturning Tools full-size finisher, the first job, as ever, was to get the blank balanced and to round. With the blank balanced, I carried on removing material to expose the segmented rings. I was keen to get a first glimpse at how they looked. Although I didn't realise it at the time, there is a glimmer of a problem just beginning to show itself, but more of that later. Next I needed to cut a mortise in the base. I had to do this now because I wanted to turn the blank around so I could level the top, and then I could epoxy the rim in place. Cut the mortise. First I levelled the base using the carbide cutter and shear scraping with a gouge. Then I finished with a skew chisel to remove the tool marks. Was followed by the 1/4" parting tool to define the outer edge of the recess, cutting to a depth of around 6mm. I also cut away most of the inner material with the same tool. Then I used the dovetail cutter to cut the dovetail. A quick clean up with a bowl gouge and it was done. After this I sanded just the base from 80 to 600 grit, going up to 3000 grit just on the resin. Then I applied a finish, topped off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. Now I could level the top. I used the 1/2 inch bowl gouge to shear scrape the surface and then finished off with a skew chisel to fine tune it and remove any tool marks. So onto the rim. First this needed to be passed through the drum sander to remove the top layer of resin and the mixing sticks down to the segments to leave a nice clean surface. This only needed to be done to one side. I centered the blank on top of the rim and drew a pencil line to make it easier to reposition it. Then I mixed some rapid set epoxy resin with added white mica powder. This was then applied to the top surface of the blank, and then with the blank flipped over, I married the two pieces together. I carefully positioned it, checking it with a tape measure until the resin had cured, which took about 5 minutes. Once the rapid set epoxy had cured, I refixed the blank to the lathe, and then I could finally get some real turning done. First off, I removed the excess resin on the rim, and because of the packing tape, it wasn't bonded to anything, so this actually came away in chunks. And yes, I'm wearing my Trend Air Shield Pro, so I was well protected. With the outer waste layer of resin removed, I continued to shear scrape with a bowl gouge, gradually getting the rim to round, and as a consequence, the blank became better balanced. To help reduce the weight, I cut away some of the rim to form a rough undercut. Then I moved on to the cutout to start doing the pedestal. Using a 3/8 bowl gouge, I first cut into the lower segmented ring. Then I did another cut in the mid-ring, down as far as the resin. I tried to remove some of the waste between the two cut lines, but the gouge shattered the resin, and there was so much vibration, it loosened the chuck. After a quick retightening, using the freshly sharpened bowl gouge, I continued to remove material, working on either side of the cutout, taking light cuts when I got into the resin. It was now that I spotted the problem. The joint between the two rings was not parallel to the base. Then it occurred to me that I'd be cutting away the segments to expose the resin in the core. So that should get rid of the issue, I thought. To test this, I used the parting tool to cut down into the cutout. Doing this confirmed that I could get rid of the wonky joint between the rings, so I set to cutting away the segments to make the cutout deeper and wider, but whilst I'd cured the issue in the cutout, I'd overlooked another problem caused by the same issue. We'll get to that in a bit. cutout was beginning to take shape nicely, so using the parting tool, I cut deeper into the resin core to remove the uneven bits of segments, both on the upper and lower ring. I only wanted to take just enough out, as I didn't want the inner core to get too thin. There was still a lot of turning to do, and I wanted to retain as much strength as possible. Now I was down to the finished surface of the inner core, I could see how much of the segments I still had to remove. So taking a 3/8 bowl gouge, I cut away material until the flat spots had gone, being extra careful when I got close to the resin. The catch would mean more material would have to be cut away. Happy that the cutout and pedestal were more or less to shape, I turned my attention to the rim. The undercut needed more material to be cut away to make a more pronounced overhang. Using the bowl gouge, I alternated between a sweeping push cut and shear scraping to get closer to the shape I was looking for. The undercut was getting close to being done, so I switched to the full-size carbide cutter to refine the shape and blend the Sapele segments into the resin midsection. And this is where the final problem showed itself. The joint between the resin midsection and the top of the mid-segmented ring was also out of line. You can see it become more pronounced as I remove resin over the join. I use a skew chisel to clean up the surface and remove any tool marks. In this clip and the next one, you can see how much it wobbles. I considered a few options to cure it. The best I came up with was to cut a recess over the join and fill it with coloured milliput to form a feature band. But in the end, I decided it just added character and would be best left alone. Having got the upper part more or less to shape, the diameter of the base needed to be reduced. This was done with a bowl gouge, shear scraping away the excess, finishing off with a skew chisel to square up the edge. Having done that, the base was now too thick, so I thinned it down with a bowl gouge, refining the shape by shear scraping it to form a sweeping curve up into the resin core. The outer surface more or less done, what followed was some tidying up with a mid-sized carbide cutter, blending the exposed resin in the core into the segmented rings, then some detailing on the underside of the rim, and to finish, the skew to refine the surface and clean up the edge of the rim. And with the outside done, I sanded from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit on the resin, after which I applied the finish. But I'm going to skip through that and show it with the last coat of wax applied. I'll show the full process in detail at the end. Moving on, I now had to hollow out the inside. First I had to clean up the rim, removing all the resin down to the Sapele segments, and then making the opening bigger, roughly shaping the segmented rim in the process. For this I used the bowl gouge, switching to the carbide for the thicker bits of resin. The carbide cutter made short work of removing the waste resin, so I switched back to the bowl gouge to get the rim closer to the finished shape. Shear scraping seemed to give the best results, allowing me to form a curve from the outer edge down into the bowl. The MDF waste block was the next thing to be removed. For this I started with a bowl gouge. This was great in the upper part, peeling away streams of MDF. But as I got deeper where the MDF had soaked up a lot of resin, I had to break out the full-size carbide cutter. With the tailstock removed, I started with the carbide, but even this was struggling in the resin-impregnated MDF, only managing to cut thin whiffs of material. So there was nothing else for it. After a quick visit to the Robert Sorby Pro Edge, I set to hogging the waste out with a very sharp round side cutting scraper. This was perfect. It cut into the waste, peeling away the MDF. It was so good I had to be careful not to dig in too deep. I was very mindful of the stress it puts onto the mortise. Working from the top down into the centre, I was soon through the upper part and into the epoxy sidewall. With just a thin bit of MDF in the base, I went back to the carbide, this time the mid-size. With a negative rate cutter, this is much kinder to the resin and won't cause any bad chipping. The mid-size carbide is much more controllable than the side cutting scraper, allowing me to gradually cut away what was left of the MDF, exposing the resin underneath. Then I switched to the full-size carbide to remove the bulk of the tool marks and begin the final shaping of the sidewall to end up with a finished thickness of around 10mm or 3/8 of an inch. After cleaning up the resin in the base, I tidied up the rim with a skew chisel, then I removed what was left of a mixing stick with the carbide, blending the sidewall into the base at the same time, and then I finished with the final few passes with a small negative rate scraper, and then it was done. I sanded from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit just on the resin, after which I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was followed with a good application of sanding sealer, which was de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue was picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing, beginning with Merca Shine 10, just a single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Shine 5, another single application, thoroughly polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. That's it, another project finished, and overall I'm very happy with it, and I hope you like it too. It's definitely one that I've learned a lot from, and I will be doing another, with a few changes, and perhaps more contrasty and colourful. Anyway, with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.